So today I'm going to be talking about um, how to build neural nets that know what they don't know. And this is joint work with lots of awesome collaborators at Google Brain and other teams in Google Research. So um, the way I'm going to structure this talk is I'm going to spend some time motivating why we are looking at these problems. Since this audience is already familiar with probabilistic machine learning, I'll keep that part brief, but it helps to get everybody on the same page to kind of like motivate the kind of tasks that I'm going to be talking a bit later on. And then I'm going to be also mainly focusing on two recent directions from our team and kind of like motivate why we are working on these topics. So, and I'm happy to take any questions in between or later as well. So just let me know if you have any questions. All right, so let's dive in. So just some basic motivation and getting the definitions right. So what do we mean by uncertainty? So in the simplest form, you can just think of uncertainty as returning a distribution or predictions rather than just a single prediction. So for classification problems, this would just mean instead of just outputting the label, we also output the confidence. And for regression problems, in the simplest form, it would mean outputting not just the mean or a point estimate, but also the variance. So quantifying the uncertainty. And to set up the notation on the right, I have like two simple examples of P of y given x, where x are the features, y are the targets. So that's going to be the notation I'll use for the rest of the talk. And why do we care about uncertainty? Because we care about uncertainty because good uncertainty estimates quantify when we can trust the model's predictions. And this is going to be a major theme going forward in the next few slides. So also to set up some more notation, what do we mean by out of distribution robustness? So most of machine learning and deep learning also, I would say, in the initial part, focused on the so-called IID setting, where the test distribution is assumed to come from the same distribution as the train. However, recently, in the past couple of years, there's been this push towards moving more towards the so-called out of distribution generalization and settings, where we are interested in like beyond the IID setting, going beyond the IID setting and evaluating the model performance in the OOD setting. And there are different, there's not really like one OOD setting. It's important to be aware of that. There's only one way to be IID. There's many different ways you can be like out of distribution. So just to give some examples of dataset shift. So one commonly studied setting is a so-called covariate shift setting, where we assume that the distribution of features change, but the P of y given x is fixed. And the open set recognition setting, where we are interested in the setting where new classes may appear at test time that were not seen during the training data. And there's also other, I'll primarily focus on these two, but there are also like other types of dataset shifts, such as subpopulation shift, where the frequencies of the data subpopulations change, and label shift, where the distribution of labels change, but P of x given y is fixed. So there are many different types of out of distribution shifts. And the reason why I bring up the OOD shift is as we move more towards this OOD setting, it is inevitable that the model will make some mistakes because the IID assumption is broken. So it's especially the importance of uncertainty becomes especially very significant as we move beyond the IID setting. There are, of course, like applications where we care about uncertainty in the IID setting as well, but just evaluating uncertainty on IID setting is not sufficient, and it's necessary for the for good uncertainty quantification is one of the key can be really important as we move towards the OOD setting. So a lot of the evals that we do, we focus on evaluating the quality of model calibration, uncertainty, etc. on the OOD setting. So that's why I'm talking about uncertainty and OOD robustness jointly. So a motivating example that I like to use a lot is ImageNet-C. And the reason is ImageNet is considered one of the big success stories of deep learning, right? Like, and if you look at the performance of deep nets on the IID setting, they indeed achieve amazing performance. But there is a very easy way to see how current models don't work so well. And this paper by Hendricks and Dietrich, they proposed this benchmark called ImageNetC, where they simply propose to take the clean test set or the IID test set and then gradually add some noise through different types of like corruptions. And these are not even like adversarial, they are just like common corruptions. And one of the nice things about this benchmark is that it almost gives you like a knob to control the amount of overdiness, which progressively increase the distance between train and test. And we can kind of like measure how model performance changes through these shifts. And one of the first observations is that if you look at the accuracy of the models, you'll see that the accuracy of the models starts dropping quite quickly as we increase in like dataset shift. However, so the next interesting question is, okay, if the model accuracy drops, if we did have like good uncertainty estimates, we could just trust the model in the neighborhood of wherever the model is most confident, and maybe the model is most confident near the neighborhood of the training data or the IID set, then we'll mostly rely on the model's predictions in the neighborhood of the data, and then like not trust the model as we move forward. And so if we had like well-calibrated estimates that would allow us to do something like that. So let's look at the calibration of the models. And one of the findings that we did in this benchmark from a couple of years ago was that it's not just the accuracy, but also the model calibration that can drop as shift increases. And for those of you not familiar with calibration error, I really just think of it as the model confidence. You can think of it as its own subjective predicted probability of correctness, right? Like, so model confidence is the model's own estimate of its correctness. The accuracy is the frequent test. When you actually evaluate the correctness on like some data, it gives you the observed frequency of correctness. So calibration basically just measures how well these two align. So you can almost think of it as a meta accuracy of some sort. So where we measure how good is the probability of the predicted probability of correctness, and how well it matches with the actual observed frequency of correctness, and lower values are better. So one of the first findings is that the model calibration also gets worse with dataset shift. So clearly the model is making more mistakes, but it does not know that it's making more mistakes. So this is why I've been motivating about like uncertainty and out of distribution robustness. And that's quite clear from this graph that in an ideal world, we would expect like a perfect calibration where the calibration curve is pretty much flat and close to zero as possible. Whereas what we see here is that when the model accuracy drops, it's not necessarily better calibrated in those settings, and that's a big problem. And the other motivating example that I like to give is let's think about like some really simple examples, right? Like, so like Half Moons, which is like this 2D toy dataset where the blue and orange denote the training classes, and we are looking at the confidence landscape from like a vanilla neural net. And the ideal behavior that we expect, and of course this is a GP seminar, so I have to Gaussian processes do amazingly well on these tasks, and they do recover this ideal behavior where the model confidence is highest in the vicinity of the training data, and as you go further and further away from the blue and orange manifolds, the model uncertainty naturally increases, and this is kind of like the expected behavior. However, if you just train like a simple MLP with like ReLU and then visualize the uncertainty landscape, it basically looks like this, where you see that so purple means the model is very highly confident, and the model only exhibits uncertainty near the classification boundary, and pretty much everywhere else it gives like high confidence predictions. And one of the motivating questions is, how do we kind of get the Gaussian process like behavior while retaining all the advantages of like neural nets? And these are the two running examples I'm going to be using for the rest of the talk. So I motivated the problems, but I also wanted to give like a flavor of the type of applications that pop up and what are the interesting downstream tasks where uncertainty comes into the picture. So obviously healthcare is a great motivating example for a lot of these ideas. and where you can think about using the model uncertainty to decide when to trust the model or defer to human. So if you think about like vanilla binary classification, where the typical 2 by 2 matrix, one of the benefits of uncertainty is that it enables a new action almost, where the model can learn to abstain or defer by saying I don't know, in cases where it's like and it's better to pick this action from a decision-making perspective than as opposed to making an expensive mistake. So this is the setting known as like selective prediction and also various of cost-sensitive decision-making and so on. So better uncertainty quantification can enable better decisions in healthcare. The other, obviously, a lot of people have been thinking about this is self-driving cars, and here we care about like there's a lot of like data set shift through time of day, locations, changing conditions, etc. And we would like our model to be robust to all of these changes. And I also wanted to spend a bit of time motivating like open set recognition. And here's an example where the task is to detect like skin conditions from like photos of user uploaded images. And if you look at the setting, the model, given some training data, we can actually train the model to have like reasonable accuracy on the in-distribution classes. But one of the major challenges and requirements for safe deployment of the models is the model should be able to detect, operate well in the so-called open set setting, where we may encounter test inputs which may not belong to one of the K training classes. This is one of the implicit assumptions in the IID that maybe a lot of people are not thinking about. But this is a big assumption, especially as we try to deploy models in the real world. There's no guarantee that the input that the user is providing belongs to one of the K classes that we know. So for these applications, high IID accuracy is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And we also need to be able to detect OOD inputs accurately. And obviously, so far I've been just talking about like more fixed tasks where the data set is fixed and we are doing like some prediction. But in real world, the data sets are not fixed, and we continuously update models. And uncertainty can also enable like better active learning, because you can, if you have like good measure of uncertainty, you can focus on the model's blind spots and increase performance there. And Bayesian optimization, also very similar flavor to active learning, where we use the model uncertainty to guide better optimization. And finally, bandits and reinforcement learning, where a lot of these ideas kind of like come together, because when you think about like distributional RL, it enables like new types of like policies. And even like in the simple setting, where if you think about like asymmetric losses, you can qualitatively get quite different behavior when you have like asymmetric losses, because the loss corresponding to the mean action would be quite different from the expected loss when you account for the uncertainty as well. And uncertainty is a big part of exploration versus exploitation trade-off. And in the non-stationary, due to exploration, there's inherent non-stationarity in how we explore the state space, and out-of-distribution robustness also becomes quite important in RL. So here's an area where a lot of these ideas come together, and we do need like good uncertainty and robustness. So I'll just end with like a motivating section. I use this quote a lot in my talks. It's a bit tongue-in-cheek and twist of the famous quote by George Box, who said like all models are wrong, but some are useful. I like to think all models are wrong, but models that know when they are wrong are actually more useful, because you can do a lot more interesting things with it. And the reason I spend so much time motivating this is many people think uncertainty is like a nice to have for a model, and just focusing on top one accuracy is all that matters. Whereas I do think good uncertainty and out-of-distribution robustness is at the heart of so many different areas of machine learning. And if we develop simple and scalable blocks for better quantifying uncertainty and making models more robust, we can influence a lot of and enable a lot more efficient machine learning across like multiple fronts in many different downstream applications. I'll stop there. Are there any questions before I dive in? All right, so let me proceed. So I'm going to give an overview of methods, and before diving in, I'll just give a quick overview. For this audience, I'll just be like really fast. So I like to think of from these ideas from a probabilistic deep learning perspective. I am not claiming that these are exactly Bayesian or anything like that yet. I'll try to be precise when I make these claims a bit later. But I think probabilistic deep learning gives a bit of like a unifying lens to view all these methods and see how ideas connect with each other. So I do like the probabilistic perspective. So in a nutshell, the idea is we parameterize the base model, P of y given x, parameterized with some parameters theta. We effectively have a prior over functions that's specified through P of theta. And we try to capture model uncertainty by, we believe that the true posterior is multimodal. So, and we are in the over-parameterized regime pretty much in most of deep learning, where we have way more parameters than data. So of course, there's going to be like multiple parameters that are going to be consistent with the data. And the name of the game is to capture like multiple functions that are diverse and consistent with the data so that we can capture model uncertainty. And at test time, what we're going to do is we're going to capture predictive uncertainty by averaging predictions corresponding to different sets of parameters. So that's like a high-level overview. And one of the reason I present this recipe is because it naturally allows us to think about like compute. So we've done some benchmarks in the past, and one of the things that we've kind of like observed is if you take some measure of compute on the x-axis, say influence time or memory, and on the y-axis, if you look at the quality of uncertainty and robustness, what we see is individual networks. If you anchor to their performance, what we see is ensembles always do tend to improve the performance, but they obviously increase the compute. So, but in practice, not all applications may be able to deploy ensemble. So they may be interested in, say, like a different point of this curve, and we need to develop methods that improve performance across the board rather than just focus on like one set of tools in some sense. And I think another advantage of the probabilistic framework is that I motivated through a whole bunch of like downstream tasks, right? Like so accuracy, calibration under shift, selective prediction, open set recognition, etc. Probabilistic framework gives you like a clean recipe in some sense, because if you just improve P of y given x and package in all of the desired inductive biases and the behavior that we want to be reflected in this P of y given x, it pretty much improves. We don't need to worry about like the exact downstream task and custom tune, develop post hoc methods or anything for any individual task, right? Like so, this allows us to be agnostic of the exact downstream task and make sure that any improvements on P of y given x improve performance on all of these downstream tasks, basically. And I think there is value in such simplification that the probabilistic perspective provides. Right. So a lot of my work in the past few years has been focused on kind of like improving this performance, and I usually think of it as developing like a composable toolkit of sorts. So when you think from a probabilistic perspective, there are really a couple of different ways you can think about increasing the efficiency of this curve, right? Like so, the ideal spot for us to be here is this top left corner, where we increase the quality of uncertainty and robustness quite a lot without increasing the compute. But you can approach that in many different ways. So one is improving the base model, which is basically the P of y given x theta, or this is also called the single model or deterministic uncertainty quantification setting, where we basically if all we have is just like one set of representation, how do we get like better uncertainty quantification? I'm going to be talking a bit about that in the next few slides. And another way to improve performance is to efficiently average over a diverse set of functions, different set of parameters, theta 1, theta 2, etc. And you can think about like sharing parameters between ensembles and more parameter efficient, compute efficient ensembles and Bayesian neural nets, which can also improve that kind of performance. And you could also think about other inductive biases that are popular in deep learning, such as like retraining or data augmentation, and how they offer like new ways to hopefully improve the performance. And one of the themes that I hopefully also explain is that these dimensions are composable in the sense that you can combine, if you push the performance on any one of these tasks, you can also compose it with gains in like other tasks, and that helps us kind of like understand where the gains are coming from and what or the unique strengths that are provided by each of these dimensions in some sense. So I'm going to be talking a bit about that in the next few slides. So the first work that I'm going to be focusing on is our recent work on single model uncertainty via distance awareness. And this work was, we had a conference version, but we recently have a longer version out on archive, so you can check that out. And this work was led by Jeremiah Liu, Shreyas Padi, and Jihen. So the key idea, so just to go back to this framework that I was kind of like presenting a couple of slides ago, SMGP aims to improve the single model uncertainty. So you can imagine trying to start with this single neural net that's trained with SGD and make some simple changes that hopefully increase the quality of uncertainty and robustness in this direction. And I'm going to be talking about those changes in a bit, but basically the key way to think about this is we use a way to learn like smooth representation. So we change the vanilla DNN through use some spectral normalization to learn a smooth representation, and we change the typical dense layer with the Gaussian process layer, and I'm going to be talking about those changes in a few slides. So let's go back to this half moons example that we were focusing on, and then look at the confidence landscape. Just to set up the notation, the blue and the orange points are the training data, and the red is a cluster of points which is far away from the training data. And let's try and understand why do vanilla DNNs assign high confidence predictions. And the way I'm going to be thinking about a neural net here is think about a neural net as learning some nonlinear representations from x to h of x, and then using a simple dense layer, which is just like doing logistic regression on top of nonlinear features, and plotting here I'm actually plotting just the confidence because it's easier to visualize. And so yellow means the model is actually very confident, and close to blue means the model exhibits some uncertainty. So here's the kind of like behavior that we see, and let's try and understand why do vanilla neural nets assign high confidence predictions in the first place. So there are really like two things going on here. So one is what can happen. We know that neural nets can do what's called like shortcut learning, where the end behavior is models input points that are quite far away in input space can end up getting mapped to very close points in like latent space. And we kind of see that if we just visualize like a t-SNE visualization of the penultimate layer embeddings, what we see here is that the model ends up mapping the red points very close to the orange points, even though they are quite far away in like input space. And if you think about why this happens, it's because the model really just sees the blue and the orange points, right? Like so, a legitimate strategy for it to classify these 2 points is collapse the entire 2 bottom quadrants onto very close points in like latent space, because and the strategy works in the IAD setting. However, when you expect to see like new points, which are these kind of like red cluster of points, which are not seen, which could be like quite far away from the in-distribution clusters, this behavior can be counterproductive. So, this is one of the big problems. The other issue is when you use like a linear classifier or like logistic regression, the typical dense layer, it has the property that the confidence is a function of distance from the boundary and not the training data. So that's why if you see here, the model is really only uncertain near the classification boundary, and pretty much everywhere else it gives like high confidence predictions. So this is the first behavior that we're trying to fix. So the SMGP tries to solve this problem by making two simple changes. So the first one is enforcing smoothness on the representations, and we enforce by Lipschitz smoothness, which basically just controls the Lipschitz smoothness in both the forward and the inverse mapping, and learns smooth mappings. And you can already see, if you visualize the embeddings that pop out from after enforcing such smoothness on the representation, you already see that the red cluster is quite far away from the indistribution points, and it allows us to separate the OOD clusters quite well in just based on the embedding space. And of course, this is not sufficient, because even after this, if you use a dense layer, you'll still get the confidence landscape that looks like this, where the model gives high confidence predictions everywhere, including the red cluster of OOD points. And that's where the second ingredient comes in, where we replace the last layer with a distance-aware Gaussian process layer. And the way we implement the Gaussian process layer is actually quite simple. We use a random feature approximation and then a Laplace approximation on top to get the uncertainty. And the nice thing is, it's very easy to implement and it's super scalable. I'll even present like the pseudocode in a few slides. But with these changes, we kind of get the behavior that we want. So if you remember the motivating example that I spoke about, where the ideal Gaussian process behavior, where we expect the model confidence to be highest in the vicinity of training data and gradually increase as we move further and further away, we do get that kind of like behavior in this case through SNGP with just these simple changes. And I'll also, for this audience, this maybe the other variant could also be interesting. So one of the, just to go back here, hopefully this slide also motivates where the other variant, where we just take the DN, like a vanilla DNN, and put a GP on top. One of the issues, this example hopefully reveals some examples there. If the initial representations do some type of like shortcut learning, where input points which are semantically quite different end up getting mapped very close in like embedding space, the GP can't really improve performance that much, because it's really only as good as the kernel, which is given by these representations. So that's why we need to think about the smoothness of the representations as well, in addition to the quality of the last layer GP that we are kind of like plugging in these cases. Right. So just to give a flavor of results, the SNGP is highly scalable, and you can plug in with any state-of-the-art like benchmark. So in the actual conference paper a couple of years ago, we presented results on BERT using an evaluated performance on intent detection benchmark, and we also presented results on the typical image benchmarks using ResNet backbone. And I won't talk about all of the results here, but just comparing to the vanilla deterministic baseline versus SNGP, one of the key behaviors that we see is it does not lead to any drop in accuracy. So it does not, and this is consistent with the example before, where we don't necessarily change the top one prediction across the board, but we mainly focus on improving the quality of uncertainty, and that's reflected in improvements in all downstream metrics pretty much. So like we see improvements in calibration, and in particular calibration under shift as evaluated on the corrupted accuracy and EC columns here. And we also see improvements on OOD detection on both modalities. And it's fairly simple to implement, so it does not require any changes to the architecture. You just need to enforce smoothness on the mappings, and spectral normalization is relatively easy to implement, and it does not add like huge computational overhead. So there is a bit of cost to computing the covariance metrics, but we've also been able to speed this up a bit since the initial publication. And the way I really think of this as a good building block for other ideas in probabilistic deep learning. Yeah, and I also want to give a shout out to this work from Yust and others in Oxford, where they've been also thinking about like similar issues around like single model uncertainty. So do check out their work as well. Right. So just to how exactly we implement this, I know there's a lot of math, but I'll quickly try to give some intuition for what is going on. Basically, what we are doing is during training, the only thing that we do is enforce spectral normalization through updating the weights. And in the final epoch, what we do is to compute the Laplace approximation after convergence. We just do like one pass through the data to compute the covariance matrix. And at test time, it really is a very simple change where we compared to the typical neural net prediction, the main thing is for the mean prediction, there is we compute the posterior mean using after passing through these random features. Then we compute the posterior variance, and then once we have the mean and variance for the logits, we can approximate this integral through either Monte Carlo approximation or like a variational approximation. Both are quite fast in this case. So I want to kind of like highlight, go back to the point that I was trying to say about like composable toolkits. And one of the questions a lot of people think about is, well, how does this compare to like other state-of-the-art methods like deep ensembles? That question is scientifically interesting, and we do have those comparisons. But I do want to kind of like point out that they are qualitatively solving two different problems, and this nuance may be a bit lost. And when we just read out some numbers in a table, it's important to recognize how exactly are these different methods solving the problem and whether they are providing complementary benefits. So I'm trying to present here that SNGP solves a different problem from ensembles. And a way to see this is, let's start with the, let's imagine the x-axis is models which are more distance aware, like SNGP. And on the y-axis, let's think about like representation diversity. And I'm going to be talking about this a bit later in the talk as well, but just take my word for it, where we do like better ensembles in some sense. And if you look at the different types of behaviors that we see, the deterministic model obviously is confident everywhere except the classification boundary. And SNGP qualitatively changes the landscape quite a bit, where we get this kind of like concentration close to the training data and less confident everywhere else. Whereas if you use like, you might also think about like efficient ensembles which try to reduce the compute, but the type of behavior you get from those models look a bit more like the leftmost column, where you look at like different ensemble variants. So this is to say that even if you ensemble and use like state-of-the-art methods like deep ensembles, the nature of the landscape, ensembles inherit the nature of the classification boundary of the ensemble is inherited from the nature of classification boundary of the underlying class in some sense. And if the deterministic models don't give like give high confidence predictions pretty far away from the data, the ensemble really only improves performance in areas where the individual ensemble members disagree, right? Like, so if all of the ensemble members are going to be like giving like confident predictions far away from the data, then the deep ensemble would kind of like look like this. But however, ensembles do serve a different purpose, which is they do end up improving the accuracy as well, which SNGP like methods don't do, and that's why they are both kind of like complementary. So on the top right corner, we actually show deep ensemble plus SNGP, and we do see some gains by combining these two in like actual benchmarks. Here visually, you do see some tightening of the decision boundary if you look a bit closely, but you do see some significant gains in like other tasks as well. So just to give a couple of such examples, a couple of more such examples. Another common trick that a lot of people use is data augmentation, and I do think here's in this regime, SNGP is actually really nice because distance-aware models can better leverage the invariances that come through data augmentation, and you can think of this as also removing some of the need for spectral normalization, which can be sometimes a bit complex to implement. If that is too complex to implement, you can also try and reduce the burden on or prevent such feature collapse in some sense through better enforcing like other invariances through data augmentation. And we do see that kind of like behavior where adding like data augmentation methods like opmix and so on end up improving both accuracy and OD detection, etc. And we do see consistent gains across the board. And if you look a bit closely, actually the DNN-GP starts working really well in this setting, which confirms our hypothesis that for last layer GP methods to work well, you really need to care about avoiding feature collapse in the representations. And SNGP also scales well to ImageNet. So some of the previous methods don't scale as well as to large number of like output classes. And whereas what we try to do is keep it really simple and scalable such that we can apply it to methods like ImageNet. And we also see that it improves the single model, but the gain holds even when you combine it with like ensembling, and the benefits kind of like compound in some of these cases. And we've also extended it to like new modalities like genomics and other modalities as well, beyond the typical text and vision benchmarks that we typically use in the field. And we do see some gains there as well in these other modalities. Right. So maybe I'll take some questions if there are any questions before going on to the next section. All right. Okay. So there are no questions. I'll go to the next part. So this is going back to the composable toolkit. So far we have looked at how to improve the base model P of y given x theta. The next part I'm going to be talking about how do we devise like better ensembles and Bayesian neural nets. And the name of the game here is to efficiently average predictions over a diverse set of functions. And you can think about like you can quantify better in two different ways. So one is for the same amount of compute, try and improve performance through maybe like increasing diversity, and this can be seen through this vertical arrow in this graph. The other approach is to think about how can we reduce the compute requirements of ensembles and Bayesian neural nets by sharing parameters, and that could be thought of as starting with these models and trying to move towards the left, towards like more efficient models for the same performance in some sense. And just to recap, a few years ago, I wrote this paper called Deep Ensembles, where the idea was actually quite simple, which is basically when we train like probabilistic neural nets as the backbone, a really simple way to get model uncertainty is to just run, keep the same model, but train it like a few different times. Typically 5 is sufficient, and when you with like different random seeds, and the different random seeds basically just means you use like different initializations and different SGD shufflings for these models, and when the base models are probabilistic, so that part is also important, which we highlighted in the paper. As long as the base model produces a probabilistic output, just these just training like multiple copies and doing a probabilistic average of these models is a very powerful baseline. And even when we did a benchmark a couple of years ago on these large-scale benchmark on this calibration under shift problem that I was talking about. So here are some results on ImageNet-C, where we look at the model calibration with like increasing shift. And one of the patterns that we kind of noticed was deep ensembles tend to be better calibrated, particularly under dataset shift, and they also improve accuracy under dataset shift. And we wanted to kind of like understand this, why this is the case, and use that insight to develop better Bayesian neural nets and ensembles as well. So we did this work a couple of years ago, and it was presented, I believe, at the Bayesian Deep Learning Workshop in 2019. And this was led by Stan Fort and Clara Hu, and where the motivation for the work was trying to understand why ensembles work well. And a really simple hypothesis is maybe the scalable Bayesian methods are all based on variational inference. So maybe we just pick points from the same mode in like function space, whereas the randomness through initialization plus SGD shuffling may be sufficient to pick points from like different modes in function space, and we kind of like wanted to validate whether this was first true. And we did that through like a series of experiments in the paper. But one of the key things that we looked at was function space distance or prediction dissimilarity. For simplicity, we directly looked at how many top one predictions disagree, which is a very simple measure and kind of what really matters when you ensemble these predictions together. So this gives you like a simple way to visualize the function space distance, but we also have visualized like other metrics like Jensen-Shannon and like other things, and the results or the trends are at least qualitatively similar based on what we see here. And one of the first experiments that we did was look at function space distance like within a single trajectory and across multiple trajectories. So basically what we did is we took like a simple coordinate on CFAT10, and then we run it for like 30 epochs, and then we checkpoint the model after every epoch. And then this is presented on the right, where we look at the function similarity and how much the predictions change as we go through like the training. And one of the patterns that we see here is that after just a few epochs, what we see here is that the model predictions don't change actually that much. So you can see with as reflected by these blue points, which reflects a very low function space distance. So the model predictions are all actually quite similar to each other. And whereas if you compare to like different trajectories, if we just take like different trajectories and look at the endpoints in function space, they are going to be like quite far away, as reflected by this curve where all the non-diagonal terms have like pretty high function space distance. And the intuition for the figure on the right, the behavior where we see like a low function space distance, is that if you think about just the nature of like how we train like neural nets, SGD, the gradients don't change significantly after a model gets a point correct, right? Like so, it does not change too much in the direction significantly. And then we also typically use some tricks like learning rate decay and so on, where the model does not for convergence purposes in deep learning, we use some of these other tricks like learning rate decay, weight decay, and so on. And but the end effect is that within trajectory, the functions are very close in like function space. That's the first observation. So, and we kind of you can visualize this in other ways as well. And here's a simple t-SNE plot where we see that if you take the trajectories and then do a t-SNE plot and color code the different trajectories, what we see is that the trajectories tend to diverge quite a bit, and the points within like each trajectory are much closer to each other than compared to other points. And once we understand this, we can also think about, well, if we add, let's say, some sort of like Bayesian method based on like a single trajectory, say we fit like a Laplace approximation at the end of training or things like this. We tried quite a few of those things here, and we also explored the entire subspace through like you can almost think of it as a non-parametric way of characterizing the whole subspace. But the trends that we see kind of are the following. So the random basically means we sample random directions and scan the whole subspace for solutions which have a accuracy above some threshold so that the models are reasonably accurate, and we pick like different points. And we also fit like diagonal Gaussian or low rank Gaussian approximations, and we also look at multicolor dropout, which is quite popular. And the behavior is consistent across all of these things. And what we see here is that even after some of these changes, you don't get as much diversity as you do through like just completely different runs of the models. And a way to quantify this is looking at diversity versus accuracy plots. So if you look at the test accuracy and pick the endpoint of one of these trajectories as the anchor point on the bottom right star, and then we look at how well solutions within like a same subspace trade-off, like diversity versus accuracy. This is solutions from different points. What we see here is that models which, when you take the deep ensemble members, they end up hitting like different modes in function space, and they all have the same comparable accuracy, but they are quite different from each other. Whereas if you, within the model, within the same subspace, when you try and make the model more diverse, you end up compromising the accuracy quite a bit. And this is suboptimal trade-off between diversity and accuracy. And from a bias variance trade-off, we care about both the bias and the variance. So we care about approaches that can reduce both the bias and the and or maximally diverse from each other in some sense. And we also have some plots in the paper to really drive home this point further. But I thought this would be interesting for this audience when you're thinking about like better ways to devise Bayesian neural nets and so on. Do think about the nature of the function space trajectories and even if you have like a fancy way of approximating the distribution within a single trajectory, that may not be as diverse as just learning like multiple runs, and that's something to be aware of when devising better Bayesian neural nets. I'll skip this plot in the interest of time, but in the paper we also show how we can use this insight to get the best of both worlds in some sense. So once that we have validated this hypothesis, there's an easy way to get the best of both, where we can take the ensemble, we can run multiple trajectories and do fit parametric approximations within each of them, and that does tend to improve performance on like metrics. So it increases the compute, but it validates the hypothesis that we do get the best of both worlds through these combinations. And I'll quickly mention some follow-up work that we have done. So one is the work on efficient ensembles, which leverage this insight. So one of the things that we found is that since it's important to be able to keep like multiple SGD trajectories, we have devised architectures such as the one here, where we create efficient ensembles, but train. These models are interesting because they share all the middle parameters. The only change is they use like different input heads and different output heads. That's why we call them like multiple input, multiple output models. And you basically train each path using like a different SGD batch. And we show that this can actually end up capturing like different subnetworks. And the beauty of this is that at test time, you just pass the same input image through multiple paths, and then you get an ensemble. You don't even need to do multiple forward paths at test time. So this is very efficient in that sense, where we get the benefits of ensemble, and this significantly reduces the compute requirements because it uses the insight that how to get like multiple SGD trajectories within like the same network. And the other work which could be also potentially interesting to this community is people wonder whether how can we, or deep ensembles Bayesian, can we look at it from a more theoretical perspective? I didn't have time to talk about this in this work, but we wrote this paper a couple of years ago where we looked at this through the perspective of neural tangent kernel, and this work was really led by Bobby He at Oxford and joint work with EY. And what we see here is actually very interesting, which explains a lot of the empirical phenomena also that we see. One is vanilla deep ensembles don't really have, they don't recover the correct posterior in the infinite width limit, but we can construct like Bayesian deep ensembles which have the desired behavior. So that's the first thing. And however, what we see here is that deep ensembles, if you regularize them, you can actually get them to capture the posterior mean quite well. So a lot of the downstream tasks, if the downstream task primarily cares about the posterior mean, then deep ensembles could give actually a very good approximation to what's going on, because even though they don't get the variance right, they can capture the posterior mean quite well. And I thought this could be interesting for folks in the audience here. So just to wrap up, our team has been doing a lot of work. We have open sourced a lot of the code. So if you're interested in pointers, please do check out Uncertainty Baselines. And hopefully I convinced you these are interesting problems, and the best performance can be achieved by composing orthogonal techniques. There's a lot of interesting open questions, so I'm happy to chat about that. And I want to thank you for your attention. Also thank all awesome collaborators without whom this work would not be possible. Thank you.
So I want to thank Balaji for the wonderful talk. And we will now move to the question, answer, and discussion period. So at this point, feel free to ask questions via the chat or using the raise your hand button in Zoom.
Yes.
Yeah, hi, Balaji. Thank you so much. Under your open questions, you have this, the second question is what other tools do we need in the composable toolkit? The first thing that comes to my mind is sequential modeling. Is, within this, deep ensembles work, is there any directions that would allow for the propagation of uncertainty from your input space to the prediction space?
What are you?
I'm thinking if I'm making inference over a time series, for example, and either for forecasting or just a separate prediction task, is there a way within sort of this toolkit that you've presented to propagate that uncertainty over time?
That's a great question. I personally haven't focused so much on time series and this setup myself, but I do think it would be fairly easy to transfer the methodology to those settings as well. I think one, I've seen some work in model-based RL where people use like these probabilistic deep ensembles, and they do seem to work quite well in those settings. But I don't know if they're necessarily propagating uncertainty through, but I think it would be interesting to combine once we have the right type of uncertainty from the individual predictions. I think like the composability and all the benefits of probabilistic deep learning, like even like Kalman filtering and those ideas start working much better when you implement the base models using neural nets. So I'm hoping to see. I would love to, if anybody has done some work, I would love to learn more about that as well.
Hi, Balaji. Thank you for the talk. It was very nice. I have a question. Have you heard of any work on uncertainty in online learning? So, for example, you have a model that is good on some classes. You know that it is predicting well on these classes, but as you train it further and further in an online fashion, you want to measure how well it is, how performant it is on those old samples. Have you heard of any work like this?
Are you thinking about like continual learning settings, or are you interested more in the online learning itself?
Yeah, more like online continual learning.
I see. Okay. We looked at some work on continual learning, and but I do think like that's actually like a regime where a lot of these ideas could work better as well. So where we can see some gains from like typical models, because preventing like learning like more smooth representations and other things should help with better generalization in those settings. I'm trying to think what would be the other closest work that we have looked at in the setting. Yeah, we have discussed looking into that setting, but we haven't done that work yet. So I think that would be like an interesting regime to explore.
I see. Thank you.
Yeah. I also see a question on chat. What is the preferred way of comparing quality of the uncertainty estimate between methods? That's a great question. So I think the way I would answer that is directly look at the downstream tasks. So we have some surrogate metrics that we typically look at, like calibration error and so on. But some of these metrics are not perfect on their own, because you can have like perfect calibration with a model that just returns the marginal probability of the labels. So if, for example, if it rains in an area 80% of the time, I can every day I can just return like probability of rain is 80%, and it'll be perfectly calibrated, and it would not necessarily be useful. So I think it's important to evaluate the downstream tasks. So we report some of the aggregate metrics like EC and OOD, but we've also done work with the individual downstream tasks in a lot of our papers, looking at like selective prediction and other tasks as well, to just make sure that the uncertainty that we get ends up improving the actual downstream task that motivated a lot of this research. Oh, I forgot to mention actually this. We also have a robustness metrics library where we implement a lot of these metrics. So if you go to the code base, you can find links there. So that could also be very useful.
So I think this is also a good time to conclude the YouTube live stream and move off to the non-recorded part of the discussion. And before that, I just want to thank all of our listeners on YouTube for joining us today, and remind that we have one more seminar coming up next week. So check that out on the website, gp-seminar-series.github.io. And please feel free to join us next week. Thank you very much.